Good evening and welcome to Free to Choose from the Barber Surgeons Hall here in the City of London. This is the second of 6 programs devoted to exploring and assessing the ideas and theories of the well-known American economist and Nobel Prize winner, Professor Milton Friedman. His ideas are of particular interest to us here in Britain, and perhaps for 2 special reasons. First, he has become, I suppose, the most well-known advocate in the English-speaking world of the free market economy, which is better known to some people as capitalism in its purest form. And secondly, it is at least widely believed that our own conservative government has based much of its economic philosophy on the ideas of Professor Friedman, and in particular on 2 of his ideas. First, that inflation can be successfully and safely cured by the government just not printing too much money. And secondly, that economic efficiency and growth and full employment can be achieved by the government simply refraining from interfering in the natural workings of the market. Now tonight, as in our 4 following programs, we'll start with a statement on film by Professor Friedman on one particular aspect of his views. And then we shall bring in our panelists, economists, politicians, industrialists, trade union leaders, to challenge him directly and in person here. Tonight we're joined by Lord Keirton, the former chairman of Courtaulds, of the Industrial Reorganisation Corporation, of the British National Oil Company, by Eric Heffer, the Labour Member of Parliament for Walton, Liverpool, and by Robert Rowthorne of the Cambridge University Department of Applied Economics. Tonight's topic is central planning and control of the economy by the government. First, Professor Milton Friedman's personal statement.
It's harvest time, and Japanese farmers gather their crops for the rice market in Kyoto. Of course, they'll try to get as much for it as possible, and the buyers will try to buy it as cheaply as possible. That's how markets are supposed to work. That's what Adam Smith, the Scotsman who turned economics into a modern science, observed 200 years ago. He observed something else, too.
In every country, it is always and must be in the interest of the great body of people to buy whatever they want of those who sell it cheapest. The proposition is so very manifest that it seems ridiculous to take any pains to prove it. Nor could it ever have been called in question had not the interested sophistry of merchants and manufacturers confounded the common sense of mankind. Their interest is, in this respect, directly opposite to that of the great body of people.
Adam Smith's flash of genius was to see how prices that emerged in the market, the prices of goods, the wages of labor, and the cost of transport, could coordinate the activities of millions of independent people, strangers to one another, without anybody telling them what to do. His key idea was that self-interest could produce an orderly society benefiting everybody. It was as though there were an invisible hand at work. The invisible hand is a phrase that was introduced by Adam Smith in his great book, The Wealth of Nations, in which he talked about the way in which individuals who intended only to pursue their own interests were led by an invisible hand to promote the public welfare, which was no part of their intention. He was talking about the economic market, about the market in which people buy and sell. And he was pointing out that in order for a butcher or a baker or a candlestick maker to make an income, he had to produce something that somebody wanted to buy. And therefore, in the process of promoting his own interests, of looking to his own profit, he ended up serving the interests of his customers. When Adam Smith published The Wealth of Nations, Britain was still largely a rural and placid place. But the Industrial Revolution was already getting started, and standards of life were beginning to rise. One obstacle was that trade with other nations was still tightly controlled. Merchants in the home market had persuaded the government of the day to impose heavy duties and taxes on all foreign imports in order to ensure themselves a protected market. One of the results was to turn Britain into a nation of lawbreakers, Smuggling was a national pastime. Brandy, wines, tobacco, anything with a heavy customs duty on it. For years, the revenue men fought a losing battle along the shores and inlets of the British Isles. In 1846, after years of argument and partial success, the followers of Adam Smith finally persuaded the British Parliament to remove all duties on goods imported from abroad. Britain embarked on complete free trade, giving a further push to the rising standard of life. What happened in Britain as a consequence of releasing the tremendous force of self-interest had the unintended effect of benefiting millions of people all over the world. And by 1851, the evidence was proudly on show at the great Crystal Palace exhibition. Free trade enabled Britain to become the workplace of the world. But was it all an accident? I don't think it was. Consider what happened in 1868 on the other side of the world, in Japan. For the preceding 300 years, the Japanese had lived in almost complete isolation. They had discouraged visitors from other nations, especially from the West. The result was that by the standards of the West, Japan was backward. It was a feudal society with lords and serfs, and woe betide anyone who tried to change the order of things. Women were third-class citizens. In 1868, a new generation of rulers decided that the time had come for Japan to make contact with the outside world. And with the arrival of the first foreign traders from the West, things began to change. The Japanese followed the British trading pattern because Britain was a leading nation of the world. So free trade came to Japan. Japan became a magnet for other people's ideas and developments. One of the first traditional industries to feel the effect was weaving. From Europe, the Japanese imported the jacquard method, a way of programming a loom to control the accuracy of the weave and so to standardize output. Workers did well in the new atmosphere, and so did their employers. The adoption of mass production techniques meant that workers were able to move out of the traditional industries and into the new industries, which all added to the trade boom. None of us can help being affected by the intellectual atmosphere that we breathe. In the middle of the 19th century, when Japan ended her self-imposed isolation and entered the modern age, it never occurred to her leaders to follow any other course than that of free enterprise and free markets. That was the intellectual atmosphere of the time, created by Britain's success in applying the principles of Adam Smith. In 1948, when India achieved independence, her leaders had all been trained in Great Britain. They had sat at the feet of Harold Laski and his associates at the London School of Economics, or of their counterparts at Oxford and Cambridge. It never occurred to them to follow any other course than that of central planning and government control. That was the intellectual atmosphere of the time. And the intellectual seed took root. As it grew, it needed to be honored, even worshipped. Every year on the anniversary of Gandhi's birth, people all over India do just that. In homage to the great Mahatma, they sit and spin, using methods handed down through the centuries. But it's more than just a symbol of honoring the past. It typifies the policy that they are actually following. The new government in 1948 decided that India's traditional weaving industry and its workers should be protected from 20th century industrialization. What were the consequences of that policy? This is India today, 30 years after winning independence. And these are scenes in a very typical Indian community, one of thousands. It's called Anakaputar, and it's about 1,000 miles south of the capital, New Delhi. This is not the kind of life the government intended to perpetuate, but it is one result of their policy. By subsidizing the cotton that the villagers spin and the cloth that they weave, they made it difficult for modern industry to develop. This is sizing. It's an essential technique in cloth production where the yarn is smoothed clean. A modern machine could do the same thing in 1/100th of the time.
The result of government planning to modernize industry is that the number of handlooms roughly doubled in the first 30 years after India's independence. Today, in thousands of villages throughout India, the sound of handlooms can be heard from early in the morning till late at night. In this village alone, there are more than 3,000 handlooms in operation.
Since 1948, 3 generations of villagers have sat at these looms, making cloth with patterns that never vary, using methods that never change.
There's nothing wrong with this activity, provided it survives the test of the market, provided it's the way in which these people can use their abilities and their energies most effectively. After all, in Japan, where the government has not specially encouraged the handloom industry, there remains a very small but very productive handloom segment. The trouble here is that this industry exists only because the government has subsidized and supported it, because it has, in effect, imposed taxes, direct and indirect, on the rest of the people of India, people who are no better off than these people are, in order to enable this activity to continue. Other industries, both textile industries and industries of a variety of kinds, have been restricted, explicitly kept back, prevented from providing more productive employment in order to make room for this industry. The effect has been to inhibit the development, to prevent the growth, to prevent the dynamic activity that could otherwise develop out of the energies and abilities of the people of India.
This looks like a factory, but it's also home for the people who work here. When they're not sitting at their looms, they eat and sleep in a corner of this hut. Throughout the world, governments always profess to be forward-looking. In practice, they are always backward-looking, either protecting the industries that exist or making sure that whatever ventures they have decided to undertake are encouraged and developed. This occurs at the expense of the kind of healthy development of new, dynamic, adaptive industries that would surely occur if the market were allowed to operate freely, if it were allowed to separate out the unsuccessful ventures from the successful ones, discouraging the unsuccessful and encouraging the successful. India has tremendous economic and human potential, every bit as much as Japan had a century ago. The human tragedy is that in India, that potential has been stifled by the straitjacket imposed by an all-wise and paternalistic government. Central planning in practice has condemned India's masses to poverty and misery. We know what has happened in Japan. Free trade set off a process that revolutionized Japan and the lives of its people. Improvements in material well-being went hand in hand with the elimination of the rigid social structure of a century ago. It's no accident. As always, economic freedom promotes human freedom. And in the meantime, what has happened to the Japanese weaving industry? This is how textiles start life in a Japanese weaving shed today. A design for cloth is placed on a drum. As it revolves, it is scanned by an electric eye. Each color, each variation in the pattern and texture is transmitted faithfully to a computer. It's all that the modern loom of Japan requires. This loom is fitted with electronics that make it one of the most sophisticated of its sort in the world. The fabric it produces is the best silk of its kind. Thanks to the speed and efficiency of these machines, the price of the silk is competitive. The workers are highly skilled and well paid. With the new technology, there's very little a loom like this cannot produce. This piece will become the sash of a traditional bridal gown. These are machine-made products, but by any standards, they are beautiful. They can stand comparison with the very finest work of the hand loom. And it's not merely the end product itself that's remarkable. The sophisticated technology which was developed to make all this possible has been adapted to other processes, part of the self-generating development under free enterprise. And it all stems from an ancient, traditional industry, weaving, that imported a new method for controlling its looms when Japan turned to free trade more than a century ago. Yet, believe it or not, many still maintain today that markets cannot be left to operate freely, that they must be controlled by government. This dockside is in Scotland. A British government, a socialist government, decided that its role was to protect the workers here from competition. So down there in Govan shipyards, they're building these vessels for the Polish government. To get the order, the British government is using the money of British taxpayers to subsidize the work. In other words, British people are making these ships in order to sell them at a loss to the Poles. Not only the Poles, but also we in America benefit from this kind of philanthropy. The steel industry in the United States makes a fine product. Other countries do too. And their steel is often cheaper, sometimes because their taxpayers subsidize it. So why shouldn't the American consumer buy steel wherever he can get it cheapest, at home or abroad? The American steel industry works very hard, trying to persuade us that it's not in our self-interest to buy in the cheapest market. They urge the government to restrict what they call unfair competition, though of course they recognize that there are dangers in this.
The dilemma of asking our government for assistance in this problem of unfair competition bothers many of us because the sword does cut both ways. But we believe that what we have attempted to do is far different than the kinds of direct government involvement that occur in many of the foreign nations around the world, where the governments provide direct financial assistance in the form of either ownership or loans or subsidies in some fashion or another. What we have attempted to do is simply to get our government to enforce United States laws against unfair competition that have been on the United States books. We draw a clear distinction between that and, for example, the several $100 million that the French government has granted to the French steel companies, or that the British Steel Corporation has received $1.3 billion for capital investment this year. So that while we are uneasy in any way interfacing with our government in what we traditionally believe are the free enterprise prerogatives, yet what we're only asking for is that the government enforce the laws that our Congress has passed. And I'm not sure that that's really any different than asking someone to arrest someone that commits a crime. I don't think we would be accused of being reactionary if we reported somebody who was stealing to the police if it were in violation of a U.S. law. We think that we're doing exactly the same thing when we bring cases against foreign producers who we believe are violating U.S. laws.
The fallacy with that argument is that it begs the real question. Why should there be laws that in effect prevent you and me from buying in the cheapest market? When anyone complains about unfair competition, consumers beware. That is really a cry for special privilege, always at the expense of the consumer. What we need in this country is free competition. As consumers buying in an international market, the more unfair the competition, the better. That means lower prices and better quality for us. If foreign governments want to use their taxpayers' money to sell people in the United States goods below cost, why should we complain? Their own taxpayers will complain soon enough, and it will not last for very long. History provides lots of evidence on what happens when government-protected industries compete with industries who have to operate in an open and free market. It's almost always the government-protected industries that come out second best. Ask Sir Freddie Laker, the Englishman who introduced low-cost air traffic across the Atlantic. Who were his chief competitors? They were all government-protected, government-financed, government-regulated airlines. He came out very well, made a mint of money, and you and I have gotten cheaper travel across the Atlantic. Nothing would promote the long-run health of the steel industry, make it into a more efficient, profitable, and productive industry than for the U.S. government to keep its hands off, neither providing special privileges nor imposing special restraints. And what's true for the steel industry is true for every other industry in the country. These women work in an industry that so far hasn't asked for special protection, the silicon chip industry. Every one of these small squares on this disk is a highly complicated, integrated micro circuit. An American technician examines them for defects. It's highly skilled work, and she's had a lot of training. When she's done her job, the rejects will be separated from the rest, and the good circuits will be packed up and sent halfway round the world to Malaysia. The product of American technological skills returns looking like this. Each microcircuit has been enclosed in ceramic by a Malaysian worker who is highly productive at this sort of work, but the Malaysians are not able to test their products. So back they come here to America to be fed into these machines. American engineers are good at producing sophisticated machines. In an operation that lasts a fraction of a second, these machines can test every circuit, can grade it for quality, and then can sort it into one of 6 different categories of reliability. The invisible hand in this free market has done wonders for both the American girls and their Malaysian counterparts. And that's not the end yet, because American silicon chips are exported to many countries where foreign workers assemble them. The final product is then returned to our stores so that you and I, the consumers, can benefit from $10 calculators, as well as from a lot of other electronic devices that not long ago simply did not exist. When this hi-fi equipment first came on the market, only the rich could afford it. But even when the international market in labor is seen to work to everyone's advantage, people still put up arguments against it. The usual argument against complete free trade is that cheap labor from abroad will take jobs away from workers at home. Well, what is cheap? The Japanese worker is paid in yen. and American workers paid in dollars. How do we compare the yen with the dollars? We need some way of transforming the one into the other. That is where the exchange rate enters in, the price of yen in terms of the dollar. Suppose, at some exchange rate, Japanese goods are in general cheaper than American goods. Then we will be buying much from Japan and selling little to them. But what will the Japanese do with the extra dollars they earn? They don't want to buy American goods. By assumption, those are all dear. They want to buy Japanese goods, but to buy Japanese goods, they need yen. Calls will come in from all over the world to places like this, offering to buy yen for dollars. But there will be more offers to buy yen than to sell yen. In order to get customers, those offering to buy will have to raise the price. The price of yen in terms of dollars will go up. As you remember, that is what happened in 1977 and 1978. By late 1978, it took 50% more dollars to buy a given amount of yen than it had taken a year earlier. But what happens when the price of the yen in terms of dollars goes up? Japanese labor is no longer so cheap. Japanese goods are no longer so attractive to American consumers. On the other hand, American labor is no longer so dear to Japanese. American goods are more attractive to the Japanese. We will export more to them. We will import less from them. New jobs will be created in export industries to replace any jobs that might have been lost in industries competing with imports. That is how a free market and foreign exchange balances trade around the world when it is permitted to operate. The problem is that more often than not, a free market is not permitted to operate. For reasons that seem to make sense if you don't examine them carefully, governments insist on interfering. But when they do, it's not possible to hide the harmful effects for very long. The main reason why the Japanese yen went up so sharply in price in 1977 and 1978 was because the Japanese government had been trying to prevent the yen from going up in price. In the process, what might have been small disturbances were allowed to accumulate into a major gap in trade. As a result, when market forces finally were permitted to operate, as sooner or later they must be, it took a major change in the yen exchange rate to bring things back into line. Why don't governments learn? Because governments never learn. Only people learn. And the people who learn today may not be the people in charge of economic policy tomorrow. As you contemplate this, you may come to agree with me that what we need are constitutional restraints on the power of government to interfere with free markets in foreign exchange, in foreign trade, in many other aspects of our lives.
Well, that's quite a manifesto. Professor Friedman is so sure of the benign workings of the market economy that he doesn't stop at telling us that governments should not do what governments, certainly in Britain and to some extent elsewhere, of all kinds, on and off, have been doing ever since the war, controlling imports, trying to regulate the overseas exchange rate of the pound, subsidizing and protecting weak industries and regions. He wants to go further and write it into law, and indeed if we had such a thing in Britain, he'd probably want to write it into our constitution, that in future governments may not do that. Well, before the electors buy that, they're going to want to be very sure that it's going to work. And in a moment, I want to bring in our panelists, Lord Kearton, Eric Heffer, and Bob Rowthorne, to challenge Professor Friedman on these questions. But first, Professor Friedman, there's one point I'd like to get clear for myself. You tell us that free trade, that's the right of businessmen to export and import at will, not only benefits people as consumers by extending their choice, but that it also benefits people as producers, that's as workers and as businessmen, by stimulating the vitality, the productivity, the growth, and indeed employment in the economy. Now, what evidence do you have that in addition to the freedom to export, which everybody's in favor of, socialists, mercantilists, free traders, everybody believes in that, but that the freedom of import also contributes to growth and to employment? Because I put it to you that the three, I suppose, greatest economic miracles of the last 100 years in the Industrial Revolution in the United States at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, same thing in Germany at the same time, and in Japan since 1948, took place behind very high protectionist walls which severely limited foreign competition and, incidentally, according to some people, contributed to the beginning of the long decline in the British economy. So what evidence do you have that freedom of imports contributes to growth and employment?
Let me start by saying that I am not in favor of the freedom of business to export and import, but of the freedom of people to buy goods and sell wherever it is cheapest and to sell their products wherever they can get the highest price. Business has no interest. Business is an intermediary between people in their capacity as workers and producers, as investors, and in their capacity as consumers. So the freedom I am interested in is the freedom of individual people. Now, if we look at the history of various episodes as you have done, you've left out some very important ones. You left out the experience of Japan from 1867 to 1897, which was discussed in the film, a period immediately after the Meiji Restoration when they had complete free trade. They were prohibited by law, by an agreement with Britain, from having a tariff of more than 5%. They had many imports of textiles that destroyed in large measure their hand-loom weaving industry. But the result of a free market was that people were better off both as producers and as consumers. They are better off as producers because you cannot export without importing. To say that you should export and not import is a prescription for denuding a country of its wealth, for transferring it to other people. Exports are the cost that you incur in order to get imports. If you get imports, if you get cheap imports, that benefits people as consumers, but it also benefits them as producers by providing them with raw materials to work with, to exercise their skills on, to use their capital on. The consequence is a higher level of living for everybody in the country. You also left out, I might say, Hong Kong, which has had complete free trade, has had a tremendous rise in the standard of life of its people. Here's a barren rock in which the population has multiplied tenfold since the end of the war, and per capita real income, allowing for price changes, has gone up about fourfold. So there are many examples, I believe, of the great virtue of free trade for both people in their capacity, both as consumers and as workers.
Let me bring in now Lord Kirton. As chairman of Courtaulds for many, many years, you had enormous experience of operating in a highly internationally competitive field. What do you think would have been the condition now of the British textile industry if we had not limited imports to the extent that we have? Would it be healthier? Would we have more employment in textiles?
No, it would be much worse off than it is today. I find it very difficult, really, to argue with Professor Friedman because he's advocating essentially a religion. He's not really advocating anything which I relate to business at all. And like all religions, he has a sort of divine presence, in this case the hidden hand and so forth, and he has the wicked principle, and the wicked principle being governments. And by sort of balancing one off against the other, he can really turn the argument any way he likes. But in the event, if you make a specific example from textiles, Courtaulds invested very heavily in very modern machinery. It operated on a 3-shift basis, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and it found itself competing with the Koreans in the early 70s. Now, the Japanese businessman had really made the Korean industry just as capital-intensive as Courtaulds had made their industry. The Koreans were very good workers, and they operated pretty well with the same output per man as the people here at home. But at that time, the Koreans were getting about 1/20th the wages which the Courtaulds people were getting. And as whatever you do with textiles, it still remains relatively a labour-intensive industry. It became extremely difficult to compete. Now, at the present time, the man-made fibre industry in this country is subject to a lot of competition from America, because America is maintaining a price for oil which is way below the world price. Therefore, oil derivatives, particularly the raw materials for synthetic fibres, are 20 to 30% below the world price, 40% in some cases. And that means to say that people in this country who are paying the world price for oil and the world price for oil derivatives are at an enormous disadvantage, no matter how efficient they are, no matter how capital intensive they are, against someone who has this purely artificial arrangement back home by which they get their raw materials more cheaply. Now, you can say that, well, too bad, we will just let the industry here be destroyed. But the conditions which lead to the destruction of your industry are usually only temporary, and a time arrives when you will really regret most bitterly that you've lost the industry which you once had.
Well, before Professor Friedman comes back, I'd like to bring in Eric Heffer, because he's well known as a prominent advocate of a whole economic strategy, sometimes called the alternative economic strategy, based, as I understand it, round as a central feature the control of imports and the protection of British industry while it is reconstructed and reorganized. Now, why do you believe in that, Eric?
Well, it's quite obvious that the way we've been going for a long time, we need to regenerate British industry. We now have the oil, which we can use to do that. And at the same time, unless we actually do have some controls in relation to imports to save the industries while we build them up again, regenerate them, we're going to have sort of industrial deserts all over Britain. And basically that's why we need to have that sort of import controls. We're not saying that you should have total import controls across the board, but we do think there should be selective import controls. Take, for example, our motor car industry at the present moment, where 60% of the motor cars sold in this country are now from abroad. Now, it can be argued, and I'm sure Professor Friedman would argue, that's fine, that's marvellous. This is the market economy at work. But of course there is another factor there. It was mentioned earlier, the question of the exchange controls. It would be a bad idea perhaps if we did something about the pound at the present moment. This isn't helping us actually at the present time. So we do need an entire new strategy. We've got to rebuild our industry, we've got to refurbish it, regenerate it, and that does imply very definitely a measure of import controls. As I say, not right across the board, and we can use our oil resources in order to do that.
Well, let's come back to Professor Friedman. We do have in Britain, after all, at the moment, a very high degree of free trade in manufacturing industry. We do have a cleanly, more or less, cleanly floating exchange rate, or we have had for some time, and yet British industry seems to be degenerating. Well, why isn't your formula working?
Well, the formula is working. The fact is that Britain has been having an oil boom. The question is, are you somehow going to have a surplus all across the board? Do you think that you ought to have a situation in which you export more oil and you also export more manufactured goods? And if so, what will you do with the extra foreign exchange you earn? Throw it in the ocean? If you would, you'd benefit the rest of the world. We'd be delighted to have you export oil to us, export manufactured goods to us. The one thing we in the United States can manufacture at lowest cost are pieces of green paper that we can ship over to you. The problem with the argument of both Lord Cureton and Eric Heffer is that they make a fallacy of composition. They look at an individual part and don't look at the picture as a whole. If the textile industry, you go back to the Korean problem of the textile industry, how can that be across the board? If they are cheaper in textiles and cheaper in everything else, if you were in a position where Britain could only import and not export, what would the other countries do with the pounds they got? You'd be in the position we talked about in the film, and the effect of that would be to change the exchange rate. On balance, Britain will import on the average what it exports, except for capital movements. The formula of both of these gentlemen is a formula for the impoverishment of Britain, and particularly for an attack on the consumer. This is the most anti-consumer measure you can take, is a measure to limit imports and protect inefficient industries. I don't know where. Maybe the textile industry should have been destroyed. Maybe it's not an area in which you have a comparative advantage. If it should, there would be some other industry that would develop in which you would have a comparative advantage abroad. Look at the situation in the United States where I know better. What's our major export industry? It's agriculture. Not because of any protection. It has never been protected very much. If you look at the history of Britain, when Britain developed the textile industry in the 19th century, there were no tariff walls. Here was Japan. Had no tariff walls at that time at all, and yet it was able to develop an effective textile industry.
Destroyed the textile industry of India, of course. We had all our manufacturing processes and so forth, and destroyed, just as you say, the Japanese industry.
But again, are you going to tell me that no industry, every vested interest must be protected? That you must have no change?
It's a different argument. You see, Professor Friedman, your argument is that free trade is always good. Now, it's quite clear that there are some countries in the world that have done very well on the basis of free trade. That's undeniable. But your film, for example, rests entirely on the example of Japan. And in actual fact, the Japanese economy for the last 100 years has been either a very highly protected economy or else it has had an extremely large degree of government intervention in industry.
That is not correct.
It was true. In the 19th century, there was free trade in the 19th century, which, by the way, was not chosen by the Japanese leaders, as you say. It was forced upon them at gunpoint by the United States in 1854, followed by Britain and France. They did not choose it. They resented free trade very bitterly, Japanese leaders. They fought a long agitational battle against it, and when they were strong enough, by the end of the 19th century, they went over to protection. And through the whole of the 20th century, Japanese industry has been highly protected. And the modern industries of Japan we know today, electronics, engineering, for example, were all developed on the basis of very strong government intervention and very strong protection. And yet in your film, you give no other serious example other than Japan. And as far as I can see, that is an extraordinarily incompetent performance in the sense that you do not discuss in any way how Japanese industry developed. You just imply throughout the film that it was based upon completely free trade and free enterprise.
In the 19th century, in the 30 years after the Meiji Restoration, there was some government involvement primarily in sending people abroad to be trained, primarily also in the steel industry and the Navy, shipbuilding, for military purposes. That was costly to Japan and did not benefit Japan. You have the other examples. We gave in the earlier film the example of Hong Kong. We have given the example of Britain in the 19th century. But in any event, let me go back to your point. I find this a very amusing situation in one respect. 25 years or so ago, when I was in Britain, I was arguing with the people at Oxford at that time mostly, and they were arguing that there was a structural dollar shortage, that the United States was a strong country that everybody else had to protect themselves against. Now we have the argument coming from Cambridge, I guess it shifts from Oxford to Cambridge, exactly the opposite, that there's a structural dollar surplus, or that Britain has a structural pound shortage, that Japan is somehow structurally to be feared. But let's look at the situation of Japan just in the past few years. Japan has shifted from a large balance of payment surplus on current account to a large balance of payment deficit on current account because of the changes in exchange rates and the effect which that had. The real fallacy in all of your arguments is not to take account of the indirect effects. If you restrict imports here, you restrict exports there. If you save jobs here, you lose jobs there. And you save jobs that are less productive, you lose jobs that are more productive.
Professor Friedman, are you seriously arguing that countries like Japan and Germany, for example, Japan in the 20th century, when it protected its major industries to build up a modern industrial base, or Germany in the 19th century, or may I say the United States in the 19th century, or Brazil in the last 20 years, are you saying that these policies were completely useless?
Yes.
Because,
of course that's what I'm saying. I'm saying that those countries would have been far better off if they had provided... Let me go back to the American
wait a
case.
minute, but you provide... The interesting thing about this is you provide no evidence of this whatsoever other than an assertion, and in your film, for example, you relied on example. You didn't rely upon argument, you relied upon example. You kept on referring to Japan. And what I'm saying is that Japan is a bad example, and in fact you can point to many other countries that have developed on the basis, very successful on the basis of very strong government intervention into industry and very strong import controls. And the point is that since those countries have succeeded, it seems to me that what you're doing is asserting, as in fact Lord Kearton said, a religious view. You're saying things would have been much better if they hadn't done it on the basis of no evidence. There's been no major country...
Excuse me, the logical argument was fully developed by Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations 200 years ago.
Adam Smith was relating to a situation when we hadn't had an industrial revolution. He was really relating to a position when we had a village blacksmiths about the largest enterprise and so forth. And this idea that each chap following his own private interests, essentially of single artisans working for themselves, is applicable to the modern world is just not so.
His basic principles are applicable. And, the funny thing about this kind of an interchange is that what you want to do is to go back to the period before Adam Smith, when you had a mercantilist society.
You keep on adducing to us extreme views. The fact that I am not 100% free trade under all conditions doesn't mean to say I'm absolutely all for import control in a massive sense. What I'm saying is, in a very complex situation which different countries find themselves at different times, you've got to have some overall management of the economy. And the idea you can leave it to the so-called invisible hand just seems to me a bit of the higher nonsense.
Well, all that I can say is that wherever you've had overall overall management of the economy. In the extreme case, it's been a disaster. The most extreme cases, of course, are cases that fortunately we're not faced with here, are the totalitarian countries, countries like Russia, China, etc.
Well,
nobody would say that that kind of overall management has been successful. If we take the case of Britain, let's take the case of Britain. You've had overall management for the past 20 or 30 years. Britain is not exactly in a state of prosperity.
I'd like to take this point up, actually, because watching the film and listening to the arguments, and listening particularly to your arguments about the position of Britain in the last century and so on, one would get the impression that the mass of ordinary people did very well in that society. They didn't. A few people at the top did very well. The mass of ordinary people, many of them lived in abject poverty, had to struggle in order to find a job. They had no sort of support in any way. And it was only when the state began to intervene did the ordinary people of this country begin to live decently, and even before the Second World War. We can take you to areas of Britain where there was misery, mass misery under the free enterprise system, to such an extent that one of our Tory prime ministers, Harold Macmillan, actually wrote a book called The Middle Way, in which he looked at where he represented and said, we have to have government intervention in order to help us out of that sort of thing, which was never happen again. And he was one of those who advocated at the end of the Second World War that there must be government intervention. And the condition of the British people has fundamentally changed, despite all our problems. Our people live at a totally different level now, and that could have only been done because of government intervention. So I don't accept your premise at all. I think it's a totally false premise. In fact, I'll say this, Professor Friedman, I really thought, when originally, before I ever met you and heard your arguments, that because you're a Nobel Prize winner, you really were something special. I have to say, you haven't even reached A-level economics in this country. I have to be quite blunt about it.
Well, that says something very bad about A-level economics in this country. But let me go back. Let me go back to your main point. In the first place, your description of the 19th century is wrong. There has, in the past several decades, been a reconsideration by economic historians of the experience of the 19th century. And what that has shown is that what happened during the Industrial Revolution was to take people out of agricultural areas where poverty is invisible and bring them into industrial and urban areas where poverty exists and is visible. There is no doubt that there was a great deal of poverty and difficulty and misery. The question is whether conditions were improving or not. During the whole of the 19th century, both in the United States and in Great Britain, there was a very great improvement in the lot of the ordinary person and not merely those people at the top, as evidenced by everything that was happening to population, to health standards, and the like. The thing is that what happens during a period like that is that poverty, the exceptions, the areas which have been held back, the bad things that happen, because of course always things are mixed, there are some bad and good, become much more visible. A Dickens could not have written his novels 100 years earlier because what he would have been describing would not have seemed exceptional. But in the 19th century, he could write his novels. If we take America during the 19th century, the evidence for the improvement in the lot of the people is the way they voted with their feet. We had millions of people, my own parents, who came from Europe and flooded into the United States. They didn't flood into the United States to be exploited. They flooded into the United States because their lot and the lot of people like them was being improved a great deal.
May I interrupt you?
Pogroms as well, which have had some effect.
The point, Professor Friedman, is not, you see, whether capitalism has not brought benefits to the world. There's no doubt whatsoever that it has done. There's no doubt whatsoever that in the 19th century the position of the mass of the people improved as a result of capitalist enterprise. I think there's no doubt about that. The point about it is whether their condition also improved, for example, because of things like trade unions or government intervention.
Absolutely.
The point is that many of the things you point to, like public health improvements, were not just because the standard of living was higher due to capitalism. It's the fact is there was public legislation on it. For example, many of the improvements that took place in the 19th century in Britain followed things like legislation over maximum working day, over things like working conditions and so on. And you can't say those are all the result of free enterprise because, in fact, they were struggles to force the government to intervene against free enterprise.
Look, in the first place, let's be clear about one thing. I am not an anarchist. I believe there is a very important role for government to play. The question that we're talking about here is whether that role includes import controls, tariffs, central planning, decisions about which activity, which area industry should move. Again, I want to emphasize that the interest I have is in the well-being of the ordinary person. And I think there's a great misconception about free enterprise and about capitalism. There's a misconception which regards it as oblivious to the problems of the disadvantaged. If we go to the 19th century again, it was the greatest period of eleemosynary activity in the history of the world.
You know, honestly, I think we're being too polite.
I want to come back to the 20th century and one or two slightly more concrete things. It's very important to discuss these philosophical issues, but there are some concrete ones. One of the things that you said in the film, Professor Friedman, it caught my eye, and I jotted it down, was that nothing would promote the long-run health of the steel industry, make it into a more efficient, profitable, and productive industry than, in this case for the United States government, to keep its hands off. Now, I assume that you would apply the same to Britain. What persuades you, and as you know, steel is very much in the public eye at the moment in Britain, what persuades you that if the British government just backed away from the steel industry and left it to market forces and international competition, that anything would happen to the British steel industry other than instant collapse?
There might be an instant collapse.
That be a good thing?
Yes. That doesn't mean, the collapse doesn't mean that the plants would disappear. It doesn't mean that the steel mills would go up in smoke.
What would happen?
What would happen is that they would get into stronger hands and better hands. They would have to reorganize their work. They would have to produce more efficiently. But suppose they can't. First of all, there's a question of scale. I really would prefer to talk about the American steel industry, which I know much better than I do the British. In the American steel industry, there is no doubt that the protection from imports has had the effect of causing them to be slow in introducing new techniques, has had the effect of having essentially agreements with labor, which has meant overstaffing. There is no doubt in my mind that if in the United States we threw the steel industry open to the winds of competition, you would end up with a somewhat smaller steel industry, but a much more efficient one.
Let me give you another example which applies to us, and it applies also to you, the whole field of energy. Do you believe, and can you explain how free market forces, unimpeded by anything else, would deal with the world energy problem, the world energy shortage, would deal with the problem of how Britain should properly exploit the North Sea oil?
Well, let me go not to the North Sea oil.
Lord Ketton was until recently chairman of the British National Oil Corporation,
yes,
which involved a government role in this.
Well, so far as the United States is concerned, the problem is very clear, that the reason we have an energy shortage is because of governmental policies, because of governmental policies of fixing the price of oil. I agree with you completely that it is undesirable for the price of oil, for the attempt to be made to hold the price of oil below world market levels. The fact of the matter is we are really paying world prices, but we're paying it partly indirectly through taxes rather than directly in buying oil. It's a fascinating thing that before the government took over responsibility for energy and for oil, there were no shortages. You can go back over the past 100 years and you never had a situation of the kind we've had in the last 5 or 10. And the reason we've had it is because in the United States, government has served as the unpaid agent of OPEC cartel. We followed perverse policies. We have actually subsidized the import of oil from the Persian Gulf, which is an absurd thing to do. So that I think the answer to your question is that if you allowed the free market to work in energy in the United States and the rest of the world, if you eliminated government's attempt to hold down the price, on the one hand, you would have an effective means which would induce people to conserve energy. In the second place, you would have an incentive for the production of additional energy. There's lots of oil, lots of gas to be found.
Are you convinced by that?
I said earlier, I think we're all being too polite because I see why Professor Friedman has become a world figure. He doesn't allow anyone else to get a word in edgeways. He ploughs on with unsupported assertions which have really got a very tenuous connection. Just here and there, you can just see the tentacle reaching down to a bit of fact.
But where are the support? Would you give me a supported assertion, sir?
The production or consumption of oil in the United States is about 18 million barrels a day, or thereabouts. Right. And they're producing about 9 million barrels a day. Right. And it doesn't matter what the government does, there's no way in which the United States can produce 10, 12, 14, 15 million barrels a day of oil. It simply isn't there. Yet the whole root of Professor Friedman's assertions is, if you took the government away in some magical way, as for the past 100 years, when the oil was there, it would suddenly appear from nowhere and then proceed to meet the market. It's nonsense.
Well, let me give you a supported assertion in that area. 3 years ago, identically the same thing was being said about natural gas in the United States, that it simply isn't there.
No,
there was a shortage. There was a shortage of natural gas. Why? Because the government was pegging a price on it.
There was a temporary shortage of natural gas. And if you refer to anyone in the industry, you have, because you put up the prices, in fact, more than double or treble the price, you've released what is known in the trade as a natural gas bubble, which will see you through for the next 2 years or so. But after that, your situation is going to be just as bad as ever it was.
You know, such predictions...
Limited resources is just not so.
If you would like to have supported assertions, as you know, back in the 1920s, there were forecasts that the reserves of petroleum would last only 5 years. Every year there were such...
I agree, and I came in there. I've been associated with that back in the 1930s. And one of the great troubles for the world has to face today, that people have cried wolf. I don't disagree with that for 40 years. But now, it isn't a question of crying wolf, the wolf's there. And whether you say it's not, it's still there.
But again, you will agree that's an unsupported assertion.
No, it isn't. All the geologists of all the major companies and all over the world have come to precisely the same conclusion. Nothing to do with government. Private industry, very distinguished geologists, very distinguished professors, some of the greatest scientists of the world, universally have come to that conclusion.
And they did in the 1920s, and they did in the 1930s, and they did in the 1940s, and they did in the 1950s. 40 years
of additional technology at our disposal. The answer's better.
Professor Friedman, you see, you use an extraordinary line of argument, because what you say is, well, people have made mistakes in the past, governments have made mistakes, therefore, government intervention is wrong. And the point is that you can get all kinds of examples, as, for example, in Germany, Brazil today, Japan, where, in fact, governments have been very effective at fostering the development of modern industries. Now, if they were as incompetent, as useless as you say, this would never have happened. In fact, if you look at the Japanese economy, to go back to it, as many big, efficient companies, almost all of those companies were founded by the government. They were provided money by the government, they were provided special privileges, and they've had those privileges to this day. And the point is that Japan is a very successful country. Germany is a very successful country, another country where the government has had very strong policies. Or modern France is another case, or Sweden. All of them are ones where the government has succeeded visibly. And it's not enough for you to say the government in a few places has made major mistakes, therefore the government is terrible, because I can provide all these other examples where governments have been very effective.
I just want to put one question to Eric Heffer arising out of that, because I think it is important that whatever the theoretical argument for or against government intervention as an economic ideology, you would, I'm sure, concede that sometimes governments do it very badly. Some people maintain they frequently do it very badly. We tend to focus very much in discussions on the failures and weaknesses of the market, maybe not so much on the failures and weaknesses of government as a mechanism for controlling, planning the economy. What assurance can you give us, what assurance do you have yourself, that those kind of mistakes by government can be reduced or eliminated, so that even if in theory there's an advantage in government intervention, that in theory can be translated into a real practical advantage?
Well, I think that we ought not to have a religious concept on either side of this argument, actually. I don't think we could agree totally with a free market, and neither can we agree with a society which is bureaucratically controlled in such a way that everything was controlled. That, I think, would be totally wrong. But I think as you extend government controls, you've got to have the safeguard of actually involving the people themselves in the decision-making process. That means you've got to inject into it forms of democratic control. That is the only safeguard. There's no other safeguard. And that means you have to have a pluralistic society, but you have to have democracy in industry as well as democracy in politics.
Eric Heffer, Lord Kirton, Bob Rowthorne, Professor Friedman, thank you all very much indeed. I hope you will all come back and join us next Saturday, when we shall be looking at the whole question of social security and welfare in the economy and its desirability or otherwise. Until then, from all of us, good night.